The night had a color to it that Adam Harlow knew by habit. The blue-white of the diner's neon sign bleeding into the wet pavement, the thin steam that rose from the vent behind the kitchen in soft, ghostly curls, the small halo the streetlight made where it touched the cracked paint of the alley wall. His breath fogged in front of him. He tucked his chin deeper into his jacket and moved with the efficiency of someone who had been awake longer than he wanted to count. The bucket and mop felt heavier tonight for reasons that had nothing to do with the weight of water. He found the man behind the dumpster, where the alley narrowed and the heat from the diner's back door met the cold. Shoes set in the wrong direction. A brittle, stooped figure bent over a plastic bag as if it were a small treasure. The man's hands shook when he pulled at a soggy paper cup. His jacket had seen better winters, and his beard was the color of old caper. For a second, Adam only saw what he had learned to see in these edges of the city, what some people called the city's forgotten things. He saw fatigue, the work of day-to-day surviving. He saw, too, the hollow of a face that was not young and not yet resigned. "Hey," Adam said, before he could find anything better. His voice didn't carry far. Alley walls swallowed it. The man startled, fingers dropping the cup. For the first 3 steps closer, Adam considered walking on. He thought of electric bills due, of the jar on his dresser that held 2 weeks' grocery money, of Sophie's pink nightgown folded on the radiator in their one bedroom. He thought of the way the landlord had said last month, casually, that if they fell behind again, there'd be consequences. He thought of the tiredness that sat behind his eyes like an old companion. Then the man looked up, and Adam saw something softer there, an imploring confusion, like someone knocked off course and trying to find the map. "Excuse me," the man said, and the syllables were slow but clear. Do you have anything?" Adam had a foam container in his hand from the kitchen, a small, lukewarm burger wrapped in deli paper he'd meant to toss but hadn't. He had thought to eat it on the walk home, something to keep the edges of hunger away as he cleaned up the back rooms and swept crumbs off booths until midnight. He could justify throwing it away, or he could hand it over and walk away. He considered the jar, the bills, the rent. He looked at the man's hands, which trembled in a way Adam recognized. His own hands trembled sometimes after a long shift. And for the first time that night, he chose a different arithmetic. "Here," he said, and the foam container felt too flimsy for the decision. He handed it over. The man's fingers closed around it like it was a small altar. He looked up with a gratitude that made Adam's chest tighten. "You sure?" the man asked. "Yeah," Adam said. "Eat." The man unwrapped the burger slowly, like reading a letter, and took a bite. The place where the bite landed, where the man's cheek dimpled, was the kind of human sign that softened Adam. "Thanks," the man said. "Name's Theo." "You hungry? You want someplace warm?" Adam asked before his better sense could stop him, as if the air could not carry his hesitation long enough to be sensible. Theo blanked. The name seemed to sit wrong and right in his mouth at once. "I don't remember much," he said, "but yes, I'd like warm." That was all it took. He could have left it there. He could have given the burger and stepped back into the anonymity of the street. But Adam thought of Sophie's small hand reaching for his after thunderstorms, of Catherine's voice knitting ordinary chores into care, of the way a warm kitchen could feel like a lighthouse to someone lost at sea. The decision felt larger than the foam container in his hand. "Come with me," Adam said. "I live a few blocks over. Warm bed, hot soup, you can stay the night." Theo looked at him as if weighing honesty against hope. When he nodded, the nod was small and uncertain, but whole. That first walk back to the apartment was thin with the city's late-night hush. Sophie's bedroom window cast a rectangle of soft yellow across the building's face. The sight of it made Adam quicken his step, as if Sophie's sleep might be broken by the sight of a stranger in the doorway. He told himself they could always say no. He told himself they could lock the hall door and pretend it had not happened. He kept moving anyway. Catherine opened the door with a practical, unsurprised efficiency. She had been a nurse for years and had learned how to hold people without asking their story. Sophie, at 6, blinked into the doorway clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear badly chewed. The rabbit was pink. Sophie's hair smelled like shampoo. For a moment, Adam got a gathering of small, ordinary images. Catherine's hands dusted with flour from the last batch of biscuits, Sophie's sock with a hole at the toe, the little red backpack by the radiator. Those were the things he protected. "You brought someone home?" Catherine asked, towel in hand. And his voice had a new edge, less careful with explanations, more uncompromising in decision. He was hungry. He said his name is Theo. Catherine looked at the man and then at her son. She didn't ask for paperwork. She folded her hands and moved on instinct, pouring soup into a bowl and setting a second plate beside Sophie's. "We have an extra night," she said, "for now." Sophie peered around the edge of the door, then slipped forward and set her stuffed rabbit on the arm of the couch with solemn ceremony, an offering. Theo sat at the table like a man amazed to be allowed 2 knives. He clutched the soup and blew on it the way a child does, bringing back a childlike care to a face otherwise mapped with adult wariness. "You don't have to tell if you don't want to," Adam said, quietly. "You can stay the night." He wiped tables with a measured devotion. He folded napkins as if folding them was a way to fold the day into something orderly. Sophie came in for a late breakfast and watched him with a fascination that had nothing to do with pity. She perched on the counter, letting her small legs swing, and handed him a napkin lion she'd made in kindergarten. Theo accepted it with the kind of delight adults rarely permit themselves. Over the following days, life adjusted itself around the new pattern. Theo learned the ritually small things, the way the milk jug was held, the drawer where Marlene kept the old coupons no one used, the exact spot where the sunlight rested on the vinyl booths in the late afternoon. He told fragments of stories between stacks of plates, small things that landed like breadcrumbs, names of towns he had visited, the feel of a boat against his knees in memory, a joke whose punchline he could not recall but which left him laughing anyway. He misremembered dates and made up for it with the kind of attention to people that can feel like a compass to someone adrift. The Harlows slipped into the rhythm of having him around. Catherine took to making extra bread, leaving a loaf to cool on the counters so Theo could bring a fresh slice when he visited their apartment in the evenings. Sophie, who greeted strangers with a frank curiosity, would sit close to him on the couch and read aloud from her picture books, the words steady and bright as sunlight on water. When his hands trembled, Sophie would press her small hand into his and ask the question the adults never dared to. "Are you sad?" Theo would look down and answer with a truth that was at once small and whole. "Sometimes." Adam watched all of it and felt a complicated rise and fall inside. Relief that the household seemed safe, fear that this fragile new world could be broken, and a cautious hope that kindness could be a way of patching not just other people, but the hollows inside himself. He found himself staying later at the diner in the mornings, lingering over a wiped table, taking the seat in the booth that gave him a view of the door. He learned the particular cadence of Theo's steps on the linoleum, and the small, involuntary smile the man wore when Sophie brought him crackers. There were quiet compensations to a life otherwise pressed thin by obligations. Neighbors began to notice. Some offered bread from their own ovens, some offered a glance that weighed with private calculation. Brad, one of Adam's co-workers, who preferred his judgments neat and fast, took to grumbling when he thought Adam wasn't listening. "You bringin' stray dogs home now, Harlow?" Brad said once behind the counter, his voice the same pitch as the sizzle from the griddle. He made his joke like a test. "You know how people work, right? They'll take a man in, and the next thing you know..." He left the implication mid-air, like a shingle loose on a roof. Adam's patience with rumor had thinned. "He's not a dog," Adam said, short. He did not have the stomach to argue about human value. "He's helping here. He wanted to. That's enough." Brad snorted. Not everyone was convinced, and whispers slid through the diner the way coffee steam found its way into corners. Some regulars softened when they saw Theo set a table just so, and others kept the distance that made them feel safe. Marlene maintained her gruff, protective warmth, watching the exchanges with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many good intentions go sideways. Theo's progress was small and stubborn and real. His tremors eased for hours at a time. His focus returned in pieces, names attached to faces, a joke that completed itself 3 days after it had been told. He told them he could not remember how long it had been since he remembered being fully himself, but that the quiet of the Harlow's kitchen made patches of memory come easier than the city's noisy streets had. One Saturday, after a week of slow improvements, Theo disappeared for a long afternoon. He said he'd gone to sit in the park and watch people and the river and let the day help him put odd shapes back into the place of his head. When he returned, he brought with him a small, folded flyer he had found tucked under a bench. It was tattered at the edges, its paper softened by rain and having been in pockets and under boots. On it, a photograph in black and white showed a man who might have been younger and sharper in jawline than the Theo who now stood at the counter wiping a flour mark from his apron. The paper read, "Missing, Theodore Bancroft, West Hills Residence, Bancroft Green Ventures, Reward, Call." Adam saw his own name printed across his skull in the sharp, involuntary sensation that happens when your world presents an impossible piece of information. The photograph on the flyer was not a stranger. There was a corner of the mouth that matched Theo's, the slope of the nose that matched, the fold in the ear that matched, though the hairline had settings and the eyes had years layered beneath them. The words West Hills and Bancroft Green Ventures shoved like a hand into the small, comfortable place they had made for themselves. He reached for the flyer to read it again and felt his fingers tremble for reasons unrelated to sleep or the night's work. For a long moment he simply stood there, the hum of the grill and the clatter of dishes receding to something like a threshold to a new understanding. It was possible, in the most literal way, that the man who had slept on their couch and learned to fold napkins might be more than the random casualty of street life. It was possible that a history existed under those tired eyes that had nothing to do with the alley. Theo watched Adam with the kind of open attention Adam reserved for his daughter's small needs. There was no theatrics on Theo's face, no performance to exploit curiosity. If anything, the flyer seemed to light a different kind of fatigue along his features, an annoyance at being upended again, perhaps, or simply the complicated blankness of someone who had been told a story and could not remember its beginning. "Found it in the park," Theo said, folding the paper on itself as if to make the knowledge smaller. Thought maybe it had something. Marlene came up behind them, wiping her hands on a rag. She took in the flyer and made a sound that could have been sympathy or frustration. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said. Her voice had a different note now, one that mixed the protection she had offered with a new practical curiosity. "If that's who he is—" She let the sentence hang unfinished. The implication was not only that there might be a reunion, it was that the diner, and the Harlows who had taken him in, might be thrust into a larger story. Adam held the paper between his fingers as if it might yield more than ink. The city had ways of making lives small. It also, occasionally, had ways of making unexpected intersections. He thought about Sophie hearing Millionaire on the television, imagining puppies and palaces. He thought about Catherine and the security a steady job could afford. He thought, too, of the quiet way Theo had sat when Sophie draped a blanket over his knees and told him about the solar system, in the way 6-year-olds can recite encyclopedias of wonder. There was danger in hope. There was danger in assuming too much. There was also the human habit of leaning toward light when it appears. Adam set the flyer down on the counter as if it were something volatile. He watched the diner carry on around them. Coffee poured, men joked at the end booth, a regular paid for breakfast in exact quarters. Later, when he walked the block back to his apartment, the city felt both the same and altered, as if a seam had been opened and something else might come through. The night where he'd handed over a foam container and chosen to invite a stranger into his life had changed. It had already moved from action into consequence. What he could not know yet was whether the consequence would be a lifeline or a test. At home, Sophie was asleep with her rabbit still on the couch. Catherine sat at the small kitchen table with her hands around a mug, the ceramic giving off a slow warmth. They looked up when he came in, and in their faces Adam read the same mixture he felt: fear, hope, a quiet readiness to do what needed doing. "What did you find?" Catherine asked. He put the flyer on the table between them. The inked photograph of Theo seemed almost tender in the kitchen's light, a stark contrast to the domestic clutter. "Someone's looking for him," Adam said. His voice was steady, though it felt small. Catherine picked up the paper, traced the printed words with a finger, and then folded it again like a map that might plot a course. "West Hills," she read softly. "Bancroft Green Ventures."
Sophie stirred and opened one eye. "Is he famous?" she asked, then blew a breath because it sounded like a question she should not have asked. Adam thought about fame and money the way people do in quiet, private ways, cautious, unsure whether such things would change them or unmoor them. He imagined a big house with bright windows, a different world where the edge of worry might lift. He also imagined what it would mean if the man they had given a blanket to had once been at the center of a life they could not yet see. "Maybe," he said, "maybe someone important." Theo sat at the window ledge where the night pooled dark and the streetlight painted the sill with borrowed light. He looked small there, a figure on the thin edge of that room's life. He folded his hands in his lap, and, for a moment, Adam saw that the man was not merely a plot point or a puzzle to be solved. He was a human being with a tangle of memory and misfortune, and still the capacity for the small, luminous things that made people: laughter, curiosity, the habit of wrapping others in quiet. When Theo's eyes met Adam's, there was a dignity in their exchange that neither money nor sympathy could touch. "We should find out," Catherine said quietly, not as instruction but as determination. Not because of anything, but because it's the right thing to do. Adam nodded. The thought of ringing a number printed in shaky font on a faded flyer felt like lifting a flipper to the surface of a deep pool. It felt like making a choice that would tilt everything. He folded the paper along its old crease and slid it into his wallet as if it needed to be kept close, like a seed that might sprout. That night he lay awake measuring next steps. He wanted to protect the fragile order they had built in the apartment. He wanted to protect Theo's dignity and agency, to let the man choose his own next moves without being pushed by a world that was quick to assign roles. He wanted, too, to keep the small, safe things: Sophie's nightlight, Catherine's humming as she washed dishes, the way breakfast felt ordinary, intact. In the end, Adam could not sleep because a question had opened. What would happen if the man who had slept on their couch turned out to be someone else entirely? The potential for a life-changing event hovered. It was both a temptation and an obligation. He thought about the children in the neighborhood, the ones who learn that kindness pays and returns, and the ones who learn that kindness compels. He thought of how often the smallest thread can tangle or reweave a life. The flyer was a hinge. There was no neat path forward yet, only a choice that had been made and would soon be tested. He did not know, walking his shift the next day, that the day would be the kind of ordinary afternoon that pushes lives into new shapes. He wiped the same booth twice, wiped it again, and kept his eyes on the street through the window. The neon washed the tiles in stripes. A small child's balloon drifted past outside and made a casual absurdity of the city. It was then that someone came running up the steps from the street, breathless and frantic, and a voice called a name Adam had only just begun to understand the weight of. "Mr. Bancroft," the voice cried, raw with a kind of hope that made the diner fall into an instant small silence. People turned like stakes drawn to a compass. The voice belonged to a woman in a coat too thin for March, eyes rimmed with red, clutching a handful of papers.
Theo looked up, then at Adam, whose hands had paused mid-wipe. The world shrank to the space between the woman's face and Theo's. "Are you?" she began, and then the words jumbled into a sound that could have been recognition, desperation, relief. "Theo? Theodore." Theo's brow furrowed. For a breathless second his expression carried no answer, and then something like memory or recognition flared like a light put to a map. It was quick and fragile, but there. The pause broke the air in the diner, and people leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the feeling of a story about to spill into being. Adam watched the scene and felt his own breath shorten. He had given away a foam container at the edge of survival and invited a stranger into his home. He had no idea that the kindness would land a name like thunder into the quiet of their life. He had no idea that in the simple act of handing over food, he had set off a chain whose next link was about to be pulled tight. For the first time that afternoon, he wondered whether kindness was a coin to be cashed or a way of seeing. He hoped it was the latter, because whatever money or titles lay behind the name on the flyer, they could not touch the quiet human act that had already been done. The warmed blankets, Sophie's shared crackers, Catherine's bowl of soup. Those things had value that would not be disemboweled by a balance sheet. The woman's face was close now, and when she laughed, a sound like a cracked bell being struck, her eyes wet with something Adam did not yet know how to name, a ripple of the whole diner softened. "Theodore, Theo," breathed, and the name sat on his lips like a key that might unlock doors. There was an address on the flyer, West Hills. There was also a company name in block letters that Adam had not let himself fully fix in his mind, Bancroft Green Ventures. The words felt far away and impossibly near. Adam felt, absurdly, like someone who had dropped a pebble into still water and was counting the rings. He took a step forward, then another, his mop forgotten against the counter. He could not know where this would end. He only knew that one small act, one plastic container in the palm of a man with tired hands, had altered the path their lives were walking down. He folded his hands together because he did not know what else to do, and listened as the woman said, between laughter and tears, "I have to make sure. I have to know if you're my father. I have to make sure. I have to know if you're my father." The woman's voice cracked, bright and raw, and for a moment the diner held its breath. Theo's face folded, as if someone had placed a lamp inside his chest and turned it on. He blinked, slow, as if the light was new and almost painful. Then he smiled, which made everyone in the room feel less like witnesses and more like the audience to something quietly miraculous. She stepped toward him, a woman with a thin coat and a stack of breathless papers clutched to her chest. And then she was at his side, hands on his shoulders, eyes scanning his face, as if trying to read the map of his life back into shape. For a delicious second, they were simply two people seeing each other, one finally clear to the other. "Olivia," Theo said, the name landing like the last note of a song. It was small, tentative, but it steadied the space between them. Olivia laughed then, a sound that was half sob and half release, and she put her head against his shoulder, as if making sure he was real enough to be kept. Adam felt his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He stood with the mop forgotten at his side, watching the reunion with a kind of stunned tenderness. The foam container he'd handed over days ago, the choice he had made in the alley, condensed into this single strange hour. He felt simultaneously invisible and central, an odd vantage point, the sort where gratitude and disbelief shared a single, uneasy chair. If this story moves you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Olivia's eyes turned to Adam then, and the expression she wore was complicated. Fierce gratitude braided with a careful professional reserve. She reached for his hand unbidden, fingers clasping his in a quiet, decisive way. "Thank you," she said simply, not theatrical, not overdramatic, just honest, for bringing him in. Adam shrugged as if to dissolve a spotlight he hadn't earned. "Didn't do much," he said. The words sounded small,
But Olivia squeezed his hand with an insistence that belied any notion of merit. "We need to get him home," she said. "To West Hills, to our house. We'll figure it out from there." Theo watched them, an almost childlike curiosity in his gaze, like someone watching a movie and reading the subtitles to see whose line belonged to whom. When Olivia mentioned West Hills, the name seemed to roll through him like a sound he almost recognized. He folded and smoothed the apron at his waist, as if it were a map he might hand someone. They left the diner as a sudden, awkward hush settled back down into ordinary life. Plates scraped, coffee poured, the griddle resumed its steady hiss. Marlene muttered something that could have been a blessing. Brad made a sound that might have been a half apology, half grumble. People returned to what they'd been doing, but the air felt thinner, as if something large had been removed from one pocket of the city and placed into a different one.
The ride to West Hills was quiet in a way that carried 1,000 half-said things. Theo sat in the back, fingers fiddling with the hem of his jacket. Olivia drove with a concentration that was more tender than clinical. Sometimes she glanced in the rearview mirror and let out a soft breath. Adam rode shotgun, and between the two of them, an unspoken agreement took shape. They would let Theo find his bearings without force. West Hills rose up like another rhythm of the city. Manicured lawns, houses set back behind hedges, the kind of streets that seemed designed to keep secrets on property lines. When the car curved up the final street and halted in front of a house with a porch framed in old oak, Adam had a ridiculous, almost embarrassing thought. It was the house you might sketch if you wanted to draw the word home. Olivia's hands trembled as she opened the door, and for the first time, Adam saw a tiredness that was not professional armor, but private wear. The long work of being a daughter who had been waiting years for a parent to come back. She guided Theo to the porch like someone bringing bedclothes to a sick child, and when the front door opened, the smell that hit them was familiar in a way he could not name. Old books, lemon polish, and a hint of pipe tobacco. A smell that anchored Theo further than any photograph might have. The house had a softness, pieces of a life placed with care. On a side table sat a framed photo of a man with the confident posture of someone who had once stood in boardrooms and garden parties. His face was younger there, angles sharp and days less worn. Olivia moved to the photograph and touched it gently. Theo followed the movement with his gaze, eyes narrowing as if focusing a lens. There were pauses, small things, the sound of a spoon on a saucer, the tilt of a lamp, set off little flashes of recognition in Theo. A story about a fishing trip, the name of a distant town, a joke he finished himself one afternoon and laughed at as if remembering the humor rather than the punchline. Sometimes the memories came in a rush, full and bright. Sometimes they arrived as tiny, stubborn threads, just enough to tug a sleeve of the past into place. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Olivia said to him that first evening, voice careful. "We'll go slow." He looked at her with a gratitude that needed no words. "I don't remember a lot," he said, quietly, "but I remember being held." Olivia's face softened into something that was both a daughter's relief and a caregiver's steadfastness. "We'll bring him back," she told Adam later, when the house felt settled and they were all sitting around a table that might have been looted right from a chapter in family books. "There's a team. We'll have doctors look, but more than that." Her voice broke, revealing an affection that had waited behind corporate briefs and boardroom language all this time. "We'll just be here, for now."
The next days were a study in small recoveries. Theo slept like a man exhausted by a life he'd been ripped away from. He woke with fragments stitched across his face, the way a map shows a coastline one bay at a time. He returned to the routines he had once known with an old muscle memory, insisting on making coffee in the morning, walking the garden path, and touching the leaves as if confirming they were real. There were moments of disorientation, places where a name might float at the margin of his awareness and then vanish, but there were also stretches where his attention seemed whole and anchored. Back at the diner, word of the reunion traveled in the only way such news travels in small places, half gossip, half halo. People who had been suspicious smiled with the kind of awkward affection you reserve for those who have borne bad weather. Brad, when he heard, made a joke that landed as a stray pebble, and then the conversation moved on. Some customers returned to their booths with a new curiosity. Others observed with the kind of reserve that keeps lives manageable. It is worth saying plainly that nothing dramatic happened overnight. Theo didn't become a different man by the time the sun rose the next day. But the presence of his daughter, the carefulness of routines, and the steadiness of being known all acted like a slow, warming draft. He attended appointments arranged by Olivia, simple checks, conversations with people who used the word rehabilitation with respectful tones, and he responded to the structure they offered. He returned home with a list of small goals: remember 3 names at dinner, walk to the garden path twice a day, call someone he loved. When Olivia finally insisted on meeting Adam at the diner, no grand speech, just a time and a coffee, Adam found himself washing the same counter with a new kind of precision. He had thought at first that the world had tilted on a yield sign and that gravity might rearrange his life in unearned ways. But their talk was practical, real, and offered with an offhand generosity that made Adam uncomfortable and relieved in equal measure. "We want to offer work," Olivia said, "not as charity, but as arrangement, not handouts, a job, stability. Theo has been adamant that we honor how you helped him, not treat it like a transaction." Adam bristled at the word offer, as if it might pin him to a cost neither owed nor deserved. I can't take something I didn't earn," he said, more to himself than to her. "You earned it," Olivia countered, leaning forward. "You earned everything with the choices you made. Theo keeps saying you treated him like a person before you knew anything else about him. He wants to make sure you and your mother and Sophie have what you need to breathe easier." She outlined, gently, what that might look like. A steady position tending grounds and facilities at one of the companies under Bancroft Green Ventures, a role for Catherine overseeing a community meals program they'd been wanting to expand, and a trust fund, planted, not spent, for Sophie's education. The terms were clear: dignity, payment, opportunity, and no strings that looked like pity. Adam's first instinct was to refuse. Part of him had a deep-rooted shame about accepting help. Part of him feared losing the hard-won sovereignty that comes with making ends meet by one's own labor. But in the words Olivia used, in the way she framed it as rightful compensation for the human service he had given, the offer felt less like a gift and more like an attempt to recalibrate an old ledger. "Let me talk to Catherine," Adam said finally. The decision made, the pressure eased like a foot sliding off a taut string. Catherine accepted without theatrical hesitation. She read the offer more like a practical piece of good news than a moral dilemma. "We'll take the work," she said. "We'll take the help, and we'll return it. Maybe we'll cook for people who need it. That's how these things should go." Sophie learned the new word scholarship and pronounced it like one of those big, important animals she'd never seen. For her, it meant new shoes, maybe a better backpack, and the comforting sense that her daddy's worry lines might soften just a little. She began to talk about field trips and summer camp with a gusto that made Adam laugh and then catch himself almost in tears. Not everyone believed the story the way Olivia and Theo called it. Rumors flared, small, city dust whispers, about motives and timing. Brad, irritated by a life he had come to see as straightforward, left comments at the counter that tasted like skepticism. "Don't get soft," he grumbled one morning. "World's full of angles, Harlow." The implication was clear. Some customers muttered that Adam must have known something. Some people suggested the reunion was cleverly orchestrated. The worst of the murmurs began when someone local posted a short, breathless account online about the janitor who struck gold. The piece framed Adam's kindness as a lucky ticket.
The headline did more than misstate the nuance, it turned a human act into a lottery anecdote. The article spread faster than anyone at the diner had anticipated, and within days, calls arrived at the Harlow's apartment from people who wanted to know the exact amount of any reward, and from others who wanted an interview that Adam did not want to grant. That pressure sat on him like a weather front. He worried that his motives might be misconstrued, that the quiet care he'd acted on might be repackaged as something venal. He feared Sophie's name attached to a sensational story. He felt at times as if the city had become a mirror that showed him only the part he feared looked worst.
Theo, watching this from a place of growing coherence, did something that surprised nearly everyone. He spoke, simply and plainly, to the regulars at the diner one slow afternoon. He came in, sat at the counter, and ordered the house coffee the way an old man who knew what he liked might. Then he turned to the small crowd assembled, Marlene, Brad, a handful of regulars, and he told them, in a voice cleared by tenderness, exactly what had happened. "I don't remember the hours I missed," he said, "but I remember a man's hands handing me a meal. I remember being cold and then warm. I remember a girl with a pink nightgown and a rabbit that had seen better days. I remember a woman who moved like Patience. I remember being allowed to be tired without having to ask for permission." He paused, and the diner leaned in like a town gathered at a crossroad. "Adam did what anyone with a heart could do," he continued. "He did not do it knowing what name I wore or what house I lived in. He did it because it was right. If you want to give him anything now, give him your respect. Give him the right to keep being Adam." When he spoke like that, with such directness, something shifted. The headlines remained, as headlines do, but the small-town chorus changed its tune. The people who had been quick to murmur were slow now. The ones who had been ready to judge caught on the wrong side of an honest man's testimony. Olivia's presence mattered in other ways, too. She refused to let the narrative settle into a stranger's fantasy. She insisted that Theo's choices would be honored. That insistence extended to Adam. She wanted these changes to be practical and durable, real jobs, meaningful roles, not token gestures. The company offered a package that let Adam sleep better at night, hours that did not cut into Sophie's bedtime, benefits that could help with medical needs, a path to something steadier than nights at the diner. Adam accepted with a caution that kept him awake at first. He trained for the new job, learning the routes of the property, the names of equipment, how to make the machinery hum instead of cough. The work was honest and physical, and not far from what he'd already done in spirit, keeping things clean, turning broken corners into workable spaces, understanding that dignity often lived in the small repairs. Catherine found her role surprising and fitting. She started a community meals initiative sponsored by a small grant from the Bancroft Foundation. Simple, hot dinners at the Maple Street Diner aimed at elderly neighbors who otherwise ate alone. She turned the project into a labor of love, calling it, with a wry smile, second helpings. She hired local cooks, trained them gently, and taught them how feeding someone could be a way of establishing a place. Sophie, for her part, took to her new school with the kind of fearlessness children have for first days and new shoes.
The Bancroft Foundation, under Olivia's guidance and Theo's quiet insistence, began to fund programs aimed at reintegrating older adults who had fallen through social nets. The projects were practical, like mobile clinics and housing assistance. They were not dramatic, but they were sustained. There were moments of friction, too, that tested the new balances. Once, when a local reporter tried to draw Adam into a headline about sudden wealth, he turned the interview towards stories of the people who still slept on cold streets. "If you want the headline," he said quietly, "print their names." It was a gentle redirection, and the journalist, perhaps caught by surprise, respected it. When the day came that Theo insisted on making a public gesture of thanks, he did it on his terms. It wasn't a check thrust into a hand with a camera present. He called the diner together, invited neighbors, old friends, and the people who'd been kind when no one was watching, and announced that he wanted to create an endowment to support the programs that had helped him and could help others. He asked Marlene to keep running the dinner nights, and he assigned Catherine a seat on the advisory board. Most importantly, he emphasized that the endowment would prioritize dignity and work. "I was lucky," he said, eyes sweeping the room until they found Adam. "But luck means little without action. We have to make sure we don't lose sight of the people who are still unseen." That evening, when the small crowd had thinned and the neon sign outside hummed, Adam found himself alone with Theo for a little while. The older man sat across from him with a cup of tea, hands folding and unfolding in the way of someone who had adopted a new small habit. "You could have walked away," Theo said at last. "You didn't." Adam shrugged, the defensiveness that sometimes shielded him settling into place. "I couldn't look away." Theo's eyes, those tired, steady eyes, studied him with a softness that made Adam feel like a child, and not in a belittling way. "You don't know the chain of things you set in motion," he said, "but you did something that matters." From that night, their bond shifted again, not as benefactor and recipient, not purely as employer and employee, but as people who had crossed a threshold together. Theo became a mentor of sorts, offering Adam small pieces of advice about dealing with responsibility at a scale Adam had not imagined. He taught with the awkwardness of a man relearning the cadence of words. Sometimes he forgot, and sometimes he said something perfectly applicable. How to remain honest when the world suggests otherwise. How to let gratitude be an action, not a debt. Romance between Adam and Olivia continued its quiet build. The courtship was a patchwork of ordinary moments. Helping with Theo's garden, staying late to finish a list of repairs, teaching Sophie how to bake cookies that collapsed gloriously but tasted like victory.
Their first real conversation, not about logistics, came one night when they sat on the back steps watching Sophie chase fireflies with a net she'd demanded in a schoolyard tantrum. "I never thought I'd be comfortable in a house like that," Adam said, nodding toward the dark silhouette of the Bancroft property. Olivia laughed softly. "Neither did I," she admitted, "but houses aren't the important part. People are." He looked at her, and the look was not dramatic. It was a look that contained gratitude, something like relief, and an invitation. "Do you think people can change the way they love?" he asked, surprised by how small the question was and how huge it felt. She considered the fireflies a long while. "I think love is a willingness to rearrange," she said, "to make space, to trade certainty for patience." He nodded. The words settled between them like a pact. Months went by with the clean rhythm of work, small triumphs, and the inevitable mistakes that come when lives are reassembled. Adam's wages allowed them to move into a modest but brighter apartment, one with a view of a small park where Sophie set up a lemonade stand and sold cups to passing neighbors. Catherine, with her steady voice, took to volunteering twice a week at a community center that had once been the site of a boarded-up storefront. Theo, when his memory cooperated, attended meetings at the Bancroft offices, read old contracts with interest, and sometimes wandered the grounds with a cane, stopping to talk to staff and visitors as if reacquainting himself with an old life. At their best moments, the new family felt like a small, functioning machine built from found parts, a rhythm of school, work, dinner, story time with Sophie, and small domestic squabbles over things like whose turn it was to walk the dog. At their worst, they argued about money or time or whether Theo's foundation should expand more quickly. Those fights were real. They were not dramatized into something they were not. They were, mercifully, resolvable. Then came the housewarming, a modest event meant to mark the family's shift from survival to steadier ground. Neighbors brought pies, Marlene sent a basket of the diner's biscuits. Old regulars made a point to be there. Theo stood at the doorway, watching the room of people who had once been strangers and were now, by dint of time and touch, related. He raised a glass, not to wealth, or to titles, or to the glamour that sometimes veils such stories, but to the small arithmetic of ordinary goodness,
To soup shared on a cold night, to couches smoothed for a stranger, to the idea that a life can change because someone else decides, without conditions, to help. "Not everyone gets a storybook ending," he said, voice perhaps a touch thick. "But every life is held together by 1,000 small moments. Don't forget that." The final beat, the wedding, was quieter than the chapter titles might suggest.
There was no cathedral, no grand march. There was a small ceremony in the back garden of the West Hills house, under a trellis of late-blooming vines, with Sophie as the ring-bearer clutching a pillow that looked far too big, and Catherine beaming like someone who had watched the sun come up on many hard mornings and now felt justified in smiling into the whole day. Olivia wore a dress that was simple and dignified. Adam wore a shirt that had been ironed with a care he'd only learned recently. They exchanged vows that felt less like declarations and more like promises to keep doing the small things that had brought them together. They spoke of patience and of building, of the way kindness had initiated the chain that led them to this bench beneath the vines. The crowd was small. Marlene presided over the reception with a stern, delighted air, and Brad, who had once made jokes at Adam's expense, clapped the loudest, applause that seemed to carry something like approval. Sophie danced with an exuberance that made 2 entire generations of adults laugh. Theo stood near the steps and watched, tears bright at his lashes. After the ceremony, as twilight turned the garden into a soft painting, Adam and Olivia lingered at the edge of the gathering. They had, at different times, feared that this life might be an illusion. Love that arrived because of money, or gratitude that became a tidy transaction. Instead, they found a fragile, honest thing, affection forged not through convenience, but through proximity and mutual bearing. "Do you worry about the future?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he said, "but I worry differently now. Not always about making the rent, sometimes about being the person Sophie needs me to be, being steady." She smiled. "That's all any of us can be, really, steady." He reached for her hand, and their fingers met in the dark like 2 notes resolving. The years that followed were not without new troubles. Theo had episodes where memory unraveled like loose thread. Medical appointments continued. Theo sometimes retreated into silences that worried them all. But each time there was a pattern of returning. People to bring him back, routines that eased the way, friends who would sit and hold space without trying to perform miracles. Theo's foundation grew slowly, funding demonstrable projects, shelter renovations, work programs, counseling, and always with an emphasis on giving people roles that preserved dignity. The Maple Street Diner remained a center of traffic for the story. People came to share a coffee, and sometimes to offer anecdotes about the day they met a man whose life had shifted into kindness. Marlene, with her apron tied like armor, continued to run the place with the same Gruck affection she always had.
Brad, softened by time and the small charm of a sincere man's approach, eventually forgave what he'd assumed was a clever plot. He and Adam developed a working friendship that included occasional ribbing and, eventually, genuine respect. Sophie grew into a child who could talk about the world with a mixture of wonder and the sort of practical curiosity children get when they are fed soup and given shelter from storms. She learned that people are complicated and kind, that the word millionaire can live side by side with leftover burger in a single universe. She learned, too, that gratitude is best expressed with action, helping with the community dinners, visiting elderly neighbors, learning to be steady even when storms came. Years later, when someone asked Theo, in one of his clearer moments, what he thought had saved him, he would say without hesitation, "A bowl of soup and a hello." Those words were not meant to reduce the depth of his story. They were meant to articulate the simplest truth he'd felt, that small acts accumulate into rescue. Adam sometimes thought back to that alley, to the moment when his decision hinged on the edge of a foam container. He never pretended it was a moral calculus that would apply universally. He knew, deep in the bone, that not every act of kindness will return such pronounced consequences. The point was not reward, the point was the small human courage to act when you see need. At the end of a long day, with the neon light outside the diner humming its evening song, Adam would walk home and find his house full of laughter. Sophie doing homework with the earnestness only children carry, Catherine preparing a simple meal, Olivia leaning into the frame of the door like someone who had learned how to stand in a life that might not always be measured by pedigree. They built a life that did not ignore the world's inequities, but tried, in modest ways, to change what they could. The story that had begun with a leftover burger and a choice in an alley had not become a fairy tale. It became instead a slow knitting of lives. A janitor who refused to look away, a homeless man who used his restored means to create opportunities, a daughter who returned home and found love in the margins, a community that learned to be less suspicious and more generous. It was messy and beautiful in the way lives are messy and beautiful, full of small, daily acts that, when accumulated, rewove the edges of several lives. On the porch one evening, years after that first meeting, Theo sat with a cup of tea and watched Sophie chase fireflies, now older and more practiced at catching wonder. Adam joined him, handing him another blanket and sitting down heavily as if acknowledging that there are weights in life that are also honors. "You did well," Theo said, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. "You kept giving."
Adam considered the years it had taken to make the life before them. The nights of cleaning, the long shifts, the risks of inviting a stranger into a small apartment, the choices to answer bells no one else heard. "We did it together," he said. Theo's reply was simple. "We did." They sat in a companionable silence, watching the light do its small magic on the yard. It was one of those silences that felt like a benediction, a life quieted not by wealth or headline, but the slow accumulation of ordinary kindness. If this story warmed your heart, like and subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that remind us how small acts can change lives.